fear is a concept that's often talked about as something that you should get rid of. So I want to talk about how does fear actually change your desires when you don't get rid of it. So I think a good place to start is to understand sort of the split between what desire does by integrating your higher and lower self, or your spiritual and material self. So in this framework, you have spirit and you have matter, right? This is your material self. And in between spirit and matter is your desires. This is how spirit translates into matter and matter translates into spirit. So there's a saying that goes, your material body desires to know spirit and your spiritual body desires to know matter. Desire is what translates those two dimensions. So in those two bodies, you have two different origins of fear. You have spiritual fear, which presses down on your desires, and you have material fear, which presses up on your desires. So what are the spiritual and material fears? So if you think about like in a religious context, right, a lot of people may have spiritual fears that relate to like retribution or achievement or judgment, for example. These are some things that we fear when it comes to the spiritual domain that we do not understand, right? You may fear that you're not achieving enough in your growth and you're not going to reach a higher density or domain, or you're not going to reach heaven, or whatever the case is. You might fear retribution, some sort of punishment for the inability to do the things that you were supposed to do, or some sort of judgment that comes along with it, right? So these are the spiritual fears. The material fears might be the more simple things, like wanting to avoid pain, for example, or wanting to avoid loss, right? There are many other material fears that we all avoid, but when you split these two categories of spiritual fears and material fears, there's one distinct thing that stands out from these. And that's one of these is related to growth, and one of these is related to death. So the spiritual fears are related to growth, and the material fears are related to death. So when we think about fear, what fear actually does is fear polarizes. It forces you to split your awareness. That's terrible handwriting there. It forces you to split your awareness to only look at things in the dichotomy of growth and death, believing that if I take these actions, they will grow me in some sort of way, or if I take these actions, they will hurt me in some sort of way. These are false truths, because everything has that dual aspect. Everything can contribute to growth and death. If we take pain, for example, which was mentioned earlier, pain can be a growth concept if it's like honor, right? Or loyalty. These are ways to where you can experience some level of pain and it can actually grow you, or even courage is another one. If we think about the death principles, there are ways that these can actually be life principles, because you need to go through a constant stage of dying in order to grow. You don't have the same cells that you had when you were born, and a tree doesn't have the same leaves it had when it was a younger tree. So death is the constant process of metamorphosis. I spelled that wrong. Or transformation. So this is how death can actually be a growth principle. And we could break down everything that a person is fearful of, whether it's a spiritual fear or material fear, and they will be able to be explained in both ways. There's going to be a dual aspect to them. So what ends up happening when it comes to fear is, if you think of the Trinity is three components, and there is the masculine, the feminine, and there's that sort of God aspect, which is awareness of what is happening between the masculine and feminine. So what happens when you're operating in fear is fear cuts this off. It totally destabilizes the awareness component. So then you just end up bouncing back and forth between the masculine and feminine energy. You end up being polarized by fear. There is no upwards ascension process that's happening because you're not getting that awareness to see how you can use these growth principles and death principles in the right way so that you can evolve. So fear is essentially stagnation. The inability to grow and the inability to die. Fear wants to hold on to dead things. So when we look at the question that this started off with, is how does fear change your desires? It changes your desires by keeping you in a perpetual state. I'm spelling that wrong, but anyways, fear keeps you in a perpetual state of stagnation. You never really grow, you never really die, you never really do anything. You don't take actions on your dreams and visions, but you also don't cut loose the things that are holding you back. And therefore you just remain stuck, and all your actions are going to contribute to that stuck state. That story you tell yourself is going to contribute to that stuck state, and all of your desires are going to contribute to that stuck state. You will say to yourself, I don't really want that thing. I don't need a partner. I'm okay being by myself. Or I don't want money, or I don't want any of these things. Those are your desires that you're telling yourself, that you're creating because you want to stagnate and stay in this place that you are. So fear changes your desires by keeping you in a perpetual state of stagnation.